helps me to do what honors him the most. That's why I'm safe. I feel so safe. That's why I'm safe. I'm safe in his arms. Because the Lord is my shepherd, I have every single thing that I need. Lets me rest in the meadow's grass, and then he leads me right down beside that quiet stream. He restores my failing health, and he helps me to do what honors him the most. That's why I'm safe. I feel so safe. That's why I'm safe. I'm safe in his arms.
Good morning and welcome to worship with Augusta Heights Baptist Church. Thank you so much for taking time to join us. I know that you could be a lot of places. Maybe you are a lot of places, on the couch in your PJs, but I know that you didn't have to tune in here. So we are grateful that you have chosen to spend this time in worship with us. Today we're continuing our summer series that we have called The Bible's Greatest Hits, with today's episode, which is Hip Hop Prophecy, looking at hip hop music and the prophecies and the prophetic word of the Old Testament. And it should be a great service. We've got some fantastic music, I can assure you. So please do stick around, invite others, share this on your feed, greet one another, welcome one another too. Very quickly, we do have a word from our associate pastor, Christine Powell-Kellett, about children and ways that they can engage in worship. So I will turn it over to her.
Good morning, friends. Because we have already had our elementary Sunday school Zoom call this morning, we will not be having a children's time during our worship today. I encourage you, however, to ask your parents to go to the link that was sent to them this morning. This link will take you to a worship bulletin, and this bulletin will help you as you stay engaged in worship this morning. We invite you to be a part of our elementary Sunday school Zoom calls every Sunday morning at 9:45. This is a great way for us to connect and to learn all at the same time. We hope to see you next week.
Thank you, Christine. And again, a word of welcome to all of you joining us. Don't forget to share. Don't forget to let us know who all is worshiping and watching, to greet one another, and allow me to begin by greeting one of our guest musicians. You'll be hearing more from him later in the service about how he understands the connections between biblical prophecy and hip-hop music as a genre. But now he is going to lead us into worship with a rap reflection. This is Joe Brewer, who also goes by Syntax the Terrific. He is not only a lawyer who has served in a federal court and now in private practice, but he has been practicing his hip-hop artistry for 2 decades now. So as we hear his music, as we hear his words, may we prepare our hearts and minds to encounter the living God and be transformed.
This is some 12 angry men pick a foreman type steez. Gavel to the bench, objecting to these. Better believe, ask Jeeves, I've seen the fatherless grieve, and the gallery cheer for the chair. My pet peeve, get free. This ain't court TV. When people go to jail, that junk's real to me. I serve the federal bench, but dog, I fail to see how we hail throwing people in jail so eagerly. Real names, real loss, real pain, real cost. I don't glorify the guilty verdict of the man's cross. We've lost our collective minds. We think crime is absolved by the crook when he's forced to do time, but it's never unraped a woman or raised the dead. Can't substitute blue lives for black ones instead. So dear God, give us justice blood red, not because we're innocent, but by what you shed.
Good morning, everybody. Happy Sunday morning to you. So glad each and every one of you have decided to join us on today. Can we all sing together this familiar hymn that we all know, Leaning on the Everlasting Arms?
Good morning, my name is Joe Brewer. I also go by Syntax It's Horrific. I've done conventional hip hop music for over 30 years, and I'm in a rap group called Deep Space 5. I'd like to thank Pastor Dover for inviting me to speak briefly this morning about prophecy and hip hop music. I'd like to start by admitting the obvious that I'm white, and whether or not I represent a credible source to you on hip hop culture, it's important to me to acknowledge my place as a guest, so to speak. But maybe now more than ever, I think it's important to make sure that sort of deference or credit is made extra clear. With respect to prophecy and hip hop music, there are many sort of superficial qualities that the two share. They're both explicit in the sense that they both can be offensively direct. They both require leadership and presence. They both depend on a literal strength of voice and persuasion and theater. From its earliest moments, hip hop has been unabashedly spiritual and religious, even as it's political and cultural. Arguably, one of the earliest prophetic lines in rap music was by Grandmaster Flash in the Furious 5 song, The Message. Don't push me, because I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle sometimes. It makes me wonder how I keep from going under. The rapper Mos Def has stated that African art is functional. It serves a purpose. It's not dormant. It's not a means to gathering the largest cheering section. It should be healing and a source of joy. Prophets speak for God, and in the church we think about them mostly in the Elijah and Nathan sense, calling us to repentance, asking people to turn from their sin. And hip hop certainly does that. It confesses its own sins and asks itself, demands itself to be better. But I'd like to focus real briefly on two other qualities of the biblical prophet and how we see those same attributes in hip hop. The first is the biblical prophet preserved Jewish culture, and then the biblical prophet communicated that culture to others. So first, hip hop is like Nehemiah. It reminds a people of who they are. It preserves the culture of a people in exile. And the same way that Nehemiah led some of the Jewish people back to Israel from Babylon, where they were in exile, to rebuild the temple, hip hop preserves and builds the dance and the language and the style and the art of Black culture. But it's also a history lesson and a kind of time capsule. It archives the difficulty and the struggle and the injustice. And in that sense, it's a kind of repository. And no other genre sort of has that same bandwidth. But hip hop, for many of us, is also like Jonah. Just as Jonah was called to share God's truth to Jewish outsiders and the Ninevites, hip hop is a window or a portal for those of us who haven't had the same lived experience of people of color in this country. It's an invitation to find some empathy and alliance. And so I think it's important to understand that hip hop is not pop radio, and it's not the club. It's a prophetic word going back now more than half a century from our neighbors and our brothers and sisters, asking us to hear their joy and their pain, their creativity and their difficulty, and ultimately their experience with God.
Our scripture for this morning comes from the prophet Amos. So hear these words from Amos chapter 5, and as we do, may we listen for a word from God. Seek good and not evil, that you may live. And so the Lord, the God of hosts, will be with you, just as you have said. Hate evil and love good, and establish justice in the gate. And it may be that the Lord, the God of hosts, will be gracious to the remnant of Joseph. But wait. I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals, I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. One of the most memorable sermons on a prophetic text came from a seminary student. And after translating the Hebrew, reading and rereading the passage, after combing through dozens of commentaries, she was ready to give her sermon. In it, she drilled down into the structure and the rhetoric. She explained the social and historical context. Then she explored the ancient word's present implications for our world and our lives. And then she concluded, and that is why this text ruins my day. Well, Amos's text certainly would have for those who first heard his words. It was a time of unprecedented peace and prosperity in Israel. The stock market was up, unemployment was down, real estate was booming. A two-room house in Bethel only stayed on the market for a few days, especially if it had the original hard dirt floors. Life is good for some. But beneath the surface, the society is sick. The culture is corroding. The distance between the haves and the have-nots is growing wider and wider. Political leaders are crooked and dishonest, protecting their own power and position instead of the people. The injustice system is corrupt. Those with privilege have set it up to benefit themselves and handicap everyone else. Religion has become superficial, something people give lip service, if any service at all. Empty rites and rituals while there is so much not right in the world. Money is the end all of the business world. There's no worry for the well-being of the workers, no concern for consumers. They only care about upping their profits. But then the prophet shows up. Amos comes on the scene to confront citizens who are climbing the social ladder and stepping over others on their way up. People who pat themselves on the back for their religious piety while treating others so badly. To tell the rich and the powerful, you have ground the powerless and the poor into the ground, beneath your boots, all the while telling themselves to pull themselves up. And while we don't hear it in English, Amos proclaims his prophecy with poetry. He uses rhythm and rhyme written in verses of vicious verbiage to battle brutal abuses to a beat. In other words, Amos raps. It's what hip-hop is, after all, stylized rhythmic music, often accompanied by a chanting, rhyming speech delivered in poetic verse. Which means this Old Testament prophet is one of the first hip-hop artists, a BC MC. Of course, hip-hop wouldn't be born until centuries later in the South Bronx in New York City in the 1970s. At that time, New York was seen as this cosmopolitan city, musically defined by disco, which we will not be covering in this sermon series, by the way. And that culture of Manhattan was one of champagne and limousines and fur coats and high-end clubs. But across town, the Bronx was burning. Corrupt landlords were paying arsonists to torch their buildings for the insurance money, while the city, who had been advised to cut and close fire departments, especially in its poorest neighborhoods, let it happen. Fire inspections went undone in those outdated buildings. Only a third of the hydrants worked. The South Bronx began to look like a war zone. Businesses moved out. There were no jobs to be had, and poverty and crime and violence were on the rise, while people at the bottom of society were trapped there. And since that beginning, hip-hop has often focused on issues of social justice. The music gives voice to the experiences of those who have been oppressed by society's economic and political and legal and social systems. As Joe mentioned earlier, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, prophets in their own way, bore witness to these realities in one of hip-hop's earliest popular pieces, The Message. Broken glass everywhere, people pissing on the stairs, they just don't care. I can't take the smell, I can't take the noise, got no money to move out, I guess I got no choice. And of course, I have to acknowledge, as I just exhibited, that hip-hop often uses explicit lyrics. Much of hip-hop music has lyrics that are violent, that are misogynistic, that are homophobic, that are laced with drug references, and I would be remiss if I didn't admit that not all rap is righteous. But some of that explicitness is intentional. It helps artists drive home their point. After all, the prophets did the same. God told Hosea to marry a prostitute, to take a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, and Hosea then called God's own people whores for forsaking the Lord. Jeremiah said that God had seduced and assaulted him, which sounds like it would fit more with the Me Too movement than an inspiring scripture. In our passage today, God says through the prophet Amos, I hate, I detest, I abhor your festivals. It's as strong a word as you can find in Hebrew. The prophets used shocking, harsh, explicit language in order to make their point. Amos doesn't say that God hates the people's worship just to say it, but to grab their attention, to tell them that the heart of their faith is dead, and like a crash cart in a hospital, Amos is trying to shock the people back to life. And we didn't even read the most shocking part of Amos's prophecy. In this same chapter, between the verses that we read, we would read, why do you desire the day of the Lord? When God would intervene, when God was supposed to make all things right. Why would you want that? The prophet asks. If you're not living like God wants, you'd be jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire, like fleeing from a lion and running straight into a bear. If you think you are right with God, but you aren't living a righteous, just life, well, that's like thinking you're safe and secure at home only to get bitten by a snake when you lean against the wall. No, the day of the Lord will feel like the end of the world. A day of darkness and not light, gloom with no brightness in it, Amos says. Now that's shocking, that's explicit, but it's even more. It's apocalyptic. It sounds like the end of the world, at least the end of the world as we know it. But that's what prophets do. And in some ways, that's what the best rappers do. Rappers and prophets are complicated, and much of their purpose is to complicate our complacency. Like poets, they are artists who are moved to describe the world with a certain kind of insight. They don't tell the future so much as they see through the present. Prophets have a vision for what truly is. They have a way of uncovering the powers that keep us bound to the way things are. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann called it the prophetic imagination, the ability to see that our present power arrangements and practices work against neighborly well-being and reveal something beyond our settled reality. That's what an apocalypse is, after all. In Greek, the word apocalypse literally means a revealing or an uncovering, pulling back the curtain on the world as we know it so that we might know the world as God would have it to be and the work to which God calls us. You know, I had somebody contact me the other day because they had people telling them that with everything that was going on in the world right now, this must be the end times. It must be the apocalypse. Now, I don't think it's the end of the world, but it might be the end of the world as we know it, as it has been. And in many ways, that might not be such a bad thing. In times like these, we need a prophetic word, a word that sees through the present to reveal what God would have us to do, who God would have us to be, a word that would disrupt in order to transform. Because this time has revealed a lot about us and our way of life. It has revealed gross disparities in healthcare, leaving certain populations more susceptible to disease and death. It's revealed economic inequities that have made already vulnerable people even more vulnerable. It's revealed how politically polarized we are. When your party affiliation is a better predictor than your education or your income or your age or your race, whether or not you will wear a mask. It has revealed the insidious depths of racism in our country and in our society and in ourselves. It has revealed just how far we are from the beloved community we hope to have a part in creating and the divine kingdom we want to be a part of. It has revealed that many of us don't want a different world to be revealed, because the world as it is works for us, for the most part. And yet this is when we need the prophetic word the most, exposing our injustices and apathy, confronting our comfortable ignorance, revealing the realities of our world, and calling us to live into God's reality, to immerse ourselves in justice, to be baptized by righteousness, to let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, as Dr. King so famously quoted from Amos. You know, I actually prefer a slightly different translation: justice like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. I like that translation because while there is a mighty need for justice and righteousness, most of the time we are not called to a flash flood kind of action, but an ever-flowing stream, the steady, constant, everyday work of God. Finding something that each of us can do, sometimes mighty, but maybe more often little by little, every day, eroding mountains of injustice, wearing away at ignorance and fear and greed and hate and pride and all that keeps us from God's purposes. Sometimes even our own hearts of stone. So yeah, hearing a prophetic word that complicates our carefully constructed lives, that challenges our complacency and complicity, that calls us to change. A word that reveals God's reality to us and just how far we are from it, yeah, that might ruin our day. But if we will hear it, and if we will heed it, it might just transform our world. It might just transform us. And you, each of you and all of you, are invited into just that kind of transformation. The invitation of Christ is to be changed, and then to join with Christ in changing our world, in creating beloved community, in building God's kingdom, in living into God's reality however we are able. And that invitation, friends, is always open. So what will you do? Be it mighty or little by little, to let justice well up in your life and pour out into the world. How will you tell God, show your ever-flowing love for God and others?
Tell 'em, Let me be patient, let me be kind, make me unselfish without being blind. Though I may suffer, I'll envy it not and endure what comes, 'cause he's all that I've got. And tell him I love him, tell him I need him, and it'll be alright. Tell him I love him, tell him I need him, and it'll be alright. Now I may have faith to make mountains fall, but left without love, I have nothing at all, and I can give away everything I possess, but left without love, I have no happiness. I know I'm imperfect and not without sin, but now that I'm older, all childish things must end. Tell him I love him, tell him I need him, and it'll be alright. Tell him I love him, tell him I need him, and it'll be alright. I'll never be jealous, and I won't be too proud, 'cause love is not boastful, and love is not loud. Tell him I love him, tell him I need him, everything's gonna be alright. Be alright, it'll be alright. Now I may have wisdom and knowledge on earth, but if I speak wrong, then what is it worth? See, what we now know is nothing compared to the love that was shown when our lives were spared. And tell him I love him, tell him I need him, and it'll be alright. Tell him I love him, tell him I need him, and it'll be alright. Oh, in the morning, baby, in the evening, baby, it'll be alright. Tell him, be alright, be alright. Ooh, be alright, be alright.
Wow. Thank you, Elena. That was amazing. And thank you all for joining us here today. As we move to the close of our service, we will sing together, "Blessed Be the Tie That Binds," to remind us that we are all bound together, not only in God's love, but through Christ's call to do the work of the gospel, the work of justice and righteousness. So let's sing together, and then I will close us with words of blessing.
Blessed be the tie that binds our hearts in Christian love, the fellowship of kin with mine is like to that above. When we are sundered apart, it gives us inward pain, but we shall still be joined in God and hope to meet again.
As we conclude our worship service, our worship through our service is just beginning. So may we go into the world to allow God's love, God's justice, and God's righteousness to flow through our lives and to shape us and our world. And as we go to do that good work, may God give us grace. Grace never to sell ourselves short. Grace to risk something big for something good. Grace to remember that the world is too dangerous for anything but truth and too small for anything but love. So may God take our minds and think through them. May God take our lips and speak through them. May God take our hands and work through them. And may God take our hearts and set them on fire this day, every day, and forevermore. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thank you again for joining us for this time of worship. We will hope to connect with you and to see you again soon. Have a great week. Take care. Be safe. And we'll see you again. Bye-bye, everyone.